Okay, so the rough patch. Why do they call it the rough patch? Is there a rough patch in every marriage?
Simple answer, yes.
Okay.
More than one usually. I named the book The Rough Patch, which is obviously a very common term. It's not only applied to what I'm writing about, but because what I was noticing in my practice as I see couples and individuals was people having this sense that they had created their life, they had partners, they had houses, they had children, they had a structure, but that sometime in the middle period, they were finding themselves feeling kind of lost or confused or stuck or feeling that something about their emotional life wasn't working. So that's what I use the term for. But the book is structured so that each chapter is about a different kind of rough patch or crisis or struggle. So there's a chapter on money issues, there's a chapter on affairs, there's a chapter on alcohol use, different things that people confront over the course of a long relationship.
And so are these the types of topics that are covered in the book, are they changing over time? Are they the same problems that our parents have dealt with and our grandparents dealt with, or is there something different now?
Well, I think people now live longer than our parents and our grandparents did. So people are trying to have close relationships over longer lives. And our model of marriage has also changed. In other words, it used to be more of an economic arrangement. In the 60s, it was more kind of find yourself arrangement. Now it's more of a, how can we have a close, intimate partnership that helps carry us through and support each other in that process. And so the model has changed and our lifespan has changed. So that's a fact of living today. There are obviously the time-worn problems that people have in relationships in terms of emotional communication and the other things I've mentioned. I think a couple things that probably all of you can relate to that are new and different are the way in which technology is completely seeped into every aspect of our lives, and all the possibilities for connecting that have been created by social media. And my understanding of that is it's new and old. I mean, it's a new way in which we deploy our time, but it's also often used in very common ways, namely to disconnect, to avoid difficult emotional situations, to have a moment of escape and privacy. I mean, all the things that people are always trying to balance in marriage anyway.
What about the trends in terms of when people are having children, or kind of some of the historical gender roles in relationships? Are those adding complexities as well?
Right, so a couple of things are really interesting about that. One is that if you look at the statistics on longevity of marriage now, the people who are staying married and not getting divorced are people who have education and economic resources, which makes a lot of sense because often they have fewer stresses in their lives. They have fewer economic stresses. They have more opportunities. It also usually means that there's more egalitarian marriage. And whereas in the past, as recently as the 60s and 70s, women's education was actually a risk factor for divorce, now it is a protective factor for marriage. So in other words, you can say that an egalitarian marriage tends to offer certain opportunities for collaboration and partnership. Of course, it also means we're all taking all roles all the time, right? So everybody is trying to be a full partner in every way: work, childcare, money, household chores, etc. So that means a lot of collaboration, a lot of negotiation, a lot of conversation, and often conflict around division of labor, fairness, who does what, that sort of thing.
And so, talking about children, how are children hard on a marriage?
Right, so children are known to be one of the hardest stresses on a marriage. Obviously, it's one of the reasons people get married. It's one of the reasons people want to stay married. Having a family is a high aspiration for many, many people. But the research does unequivocally suggest that when you have your first child, your marital satisfaction goes down. And the way I think about that, because I teach a class to young parent, well, not so young, I live in the Bay Area, and I teach a class for people who are about to have their first child. And it's basically how to keep the couple relationship strong when you have a child. And this demographic may be similar to that one. But people's big worry is, I've had this great life, I've done all this cool stuff, I'm a fully formed individual, we have this great partnership. Is this kid going to kind of ruin everything, right? I mean, that's a whole different model from when people had their kids at 21, 22, 25, whatever. And so there is this feeling that, children are going to disrupt my life often with people today. But the way I think they do disrupt your life, because I think we can all agree children are wonderful, but that it depletes resources. I mean, that there's basically more people that everything has to go around. So if you think of that purely, certainly economically, but also emotionally and time-wise. And so I think what happens with children often is that the to-do list and the hierarchy of things that have to happen, your emotional needs and your need to connect goes lower, lower, lower on the list, because of course there are much important things to take care of, and as a mature functioning adult you have to take care of the kids first, the job second. And so it's this sort of subtle demotion that starts happening about the relationship. And I think people try really hard to work on that, but what's so tricky about it is that the emotional relationship is something that is complex, is messy, emotions are inconvenient, you might feel things, you might feel angry or sad or disconnected and need to actually take time to talk about that and sort it through. And that's exactly what people are missing, is the time to do it. So that just takes its toll over time.
I imagine too that things like sleep deprivation probably play into it, at least in my own personal experience.
Right.
And things like wanting to have those conversations, but maybe not in front of the children.
Yeah, right. Less time alone, obviously. Sleep deprivation is murder for your moods, for your sense of resilience, right? All your worst qualities just are totally on display. So yeah, all of that.
So then, like a once a week date night will fix it all, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah. Now, one thing I do tell couples, which sounds incredibly pragmatic, but I think it really can help, part of the problem with date night, which I write about in the book, is that what you want on date night is fun. You want romance, you want fun, you want not to be worrying about the kids' problems all the time. And that can be hard, because if that's the top stress on your mind and your only time to talk, it's like, well, now's the time. But I recommend that people decide on a time of the week, like 8 o'clock Tuesday morning. That's not when you're about to try to go to sleep. That's not when you're going to try to have sex. It's not on your date night. And it's like, let's just take a minute to check in. How's the division of labor? How are you feeling about our relationship? Just sort of like almost like a meeting. Because what I find is so pernicious in couples over time, and this book is really about this thing, which is that our emotional life is who we are, and our relational life is who we are, and yet it sort of gets put on the sidelines, right, and so easily in terms of all our other roles. And so I think that it can be very hard to be the person who has to bring up the conversation, or has to be the person to say, let's talk. Some people are like, no, I don't want to talk, right? So if you know that it's Tuesday morning at 8 that you're going to have this back and forth, it can take the pressure off of one person to be the initiator of discussion.
Or when your spouse hears, hey, we need to talk, that they don't like start having a panic attack because it's bad.
Right, exactly. Everybody knows 8 o'clock Tuesday morning, we're going to touch base.
So you talked about having more resources can actually contribute to better outcomes. So then how can money be such a problem? If you have more money, isn't that better?
It's certainly better than not having money, right? I mean, again, on this sort of two Americas thing, where people with education and economic resources are doing better in terms of their marriage than people. I mean, that's sort of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I mean, it's the America we live in, right? So people who are at the poorer and less educated part of the demographic tend to not get married as much, not stay married, tend to marry more often, etc. And obviously, economic stress is a huge, difficult thing when you have it. But, just like everything else, I mean, it reminds me of the fact that people come into couple therapy and they say, I can't believe we're fighting about, the toothpaste tube, or who takes out the trash. This is so trivial. It's so stupid. Like, why are we fighting about these things? But of course, life is those things, right? And it's the constant navigation of those things. And money is a really charged issue, even if you have a lot of it. Because I believe the reason it's a charged issue is because it's so close to our sort of primal sense of survival and identity. I mean, especially in this country, perhaps, but how you spend money, what money you have, where you're allocating it, is very close to people's sense of who they are. And so in a marriage, the ideal picture of a marriage in my mind is there's one individual, another individual, and together you create this thing this living, breathing organism called the marriage. And so it's not just what do you want, what do you want? Oh, if you get what you want, I don't get what I want. It's what does the marriage need? What does the family need? What do we need together to make this thing that we're creating together? And I think money lends itself to a sort of zero-sum mentality, where people are kind of, if you get yours, I won't get mine, and it breaks down very quickly.
So are you of the opinion then that all marriages can work, all marriages can be made to be good marriages, or are there situations where you kind of need to know when to say when?
So when I started writing this book, I had the hope, I had the thought that if people work enough on themselves, they can work out their relationship. Because I felt in my work, one of the things you run up against a lot of times when a couple's having problems is they come in and each one wants you to fix their partner and make them a better partner. But it's very, very hard for people to really take stock of themselves and think, what am I contributing to this? So part of the work of couple therapy is you're both creating this, you're both taking a role, right? So I sort of had this somewhat hopeful, I guess, idea that, if people really grapple with their own stuff, that they can come to the relationship on a better footing, and they will be in far better position to work it out. All of which I still agree with. But I do believe also that some marriages are, in some sense, fatally flawed. And I think part of what the rough patch is about, the book is about, the thinking is about, is how do you figure that out?
And so that taking stock of yourself and personal accountability for improvement, is that what you refer to in the book as guts?
That's an aspect of it. I think people have the illusion that if the relationship's working well, it's peaceful and serene. And I don't think that. I've been married for 26 years, and I would say every day we have some kind of difficult conversation, not necessarily about our relationship with each other, but one about the kids, or one about something we have to solve. And I think I talk about guts because I say it's always going to take courage to have the difficult conversations. The fascinating thing about being a human, and this has really come through with attachment research in the last 30 years, is we never get over being dependent and attached. And so, it's not okay that my husband said I love you yesterday or last week or said goodbye then. He has to keep doing it. In other words, you have to feel that the person keeps turning toward you and giving you appreciation and gratitude and affection and warmth, right? That's never done, right? And so I sort of feel like similarly, the hard conversations are never done. If you're trying to get through life, if you're trying to figure out, are we going to retire? What's our budget like? Are we drinking too much? How's our sex life? All these things are not going to be easy to talk about. They're actually vulnerable to talk about. And I sort of want to help people shift their paradigm. It's a good day for you if they have the guts to talk about the hard things.
And so you have a part in the book that you talk about where you say that you need to get a life.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain?
Yeah. So this book is about, how do you have a close relationship over a long life? And I think sometimes people have the notion that, in order to get along with another person over a long time, you sort of have to suppress yourself or somehow just adapt yourself. And I really believe that it's only going to work if you feel you can keep developing and growing as an individual, that you bring more and more into the partnership. And I think sometimes people feel, I was just talking to a friend yesterday whose husband is a doctor, and he had all this training, and the whole family life was really geared around his life and his profession. And she said, it's been so hard for me to sort of step out of that and realize I need to start having, a voice and assert what I want. And we're always trying to balance that. How much do we have to compromise? How much do we have to suppress in order to get along? But I really think over the long haul, suppressing yourself isn't going to do the trick. You have to be developing yourself and evolving yourself. And maybe that's going to mean saying, look, I'm changing. And the way it was 10 or 20 years ago or 5 years ago isn't going to work for me. Sometimes people get upset that they feel their spouse has changed the contract on them. And we agreed under these circumstances, and now how come you suddenly want this? And in my view, it's like, of course that happens. Time's passing, you're growing, you're changing. And so, my idea of get a life is you have to sort of bring a lot of yourself to this, and you have to keep developing yourself. And that can always be a kind of messy balancing act.
And so the old adage about how marriages work, and it takes work to make a marriage, you kind of challenge the idea of what work means in that. Can you describe it?
So, there is this idea marriage is work, and everybody rolls their eyes, and it's like, ugh. And what I see as the work of marriage is being open and emotionally vulnerable. That's the work. It's hard to show up every day and be honest and say where you're at and express your feelings and communicate about them. And I happen to believe that it's not a tenable stance in a marriage to say, I don't like to talk about feelings. Basically, you may not like to talk about feelings. You may be a person who finds it hard to talk about feelings. It may be that you feel you're a person who's not an expert yet at talking about your feelings. But the job, the work, is to cultivate the ability to know how you feel and to express it. And that's not easy. And every day you wake up and it's like, gee, the easy thing to do would be to watch my shows and get on my phone and go work out and not really deal with this other complicated person who's like wants things from me and I want things from and I can't really figure out how to get along with, right? Your job is to go like, no, my job is to keep trying to turn toward this person. Keep trying to figure out the relationship. Keep trying to be close. That's not easy.
How do things like communication differences in style and things, one example being that, somebody may simply be wanting to talk about what they're thinking or feeling, and the other person thinks they're being asked to solve the problem. Right. And so when you are, how do you overcome those kinds of things in that work to stay open? Well,
so it's a complicated question, but I'll just say one thing about it, which is in, I think, chapter 3 or 4 of the book. I use this phrase called feeling with and thinking about. And it comes out of a whole tradition of psychological research that you can read more about if you're interested. But basically, we've all had that experience of being in a couple situation and one person coming home and just trying to pour out their feelings and talk about what happened and sort of process their emotion. The other one saying, well, let me, roll up my sleeves and help you solve the problem. And then the first person is like, I don't want you to solve my problem. I just want you to listen to me, right? So I believe that in a loving relationship, if you look at emotional communication, it has two parts. It has you feel with the person and you think about the person. And so you both have the experience of saying, oh, I'm listening to you. I'm trying to understand how you feel. I'm trying to sort of empathize with you. Or, you had a horrible day and I'm trying to listen and support you. And then there's, let me think about you. Let me think about the problem. Let me help you solve it. Do you want to help solve it? And sometimes couples break down. Sometimes it's along gender lines. Sometimes the roles are reversed. But basically it's like one person's fixing and the other person's just wanting empathy, right? So I think everyone should be cultivating the ability to both feel with and think about. And love is expressed through that combination.
So if you could give everyone one thing to either go back and think about or practice at home tonight, what would that first step be?
Okay, so I think there's two things that are kind of, in my mind, like the wonder drug of marriage. Basically, you can take two relationships that are identical in all their different problems and dysfunctions. But if in one situation, the partners are able to say, I'm aware of my part in this, and I'm trying to change. So in other words, what I call it in the book is self-awareness and self-responsibility. So what I mean by that is if you can look at what you're doing together and really say, I know I have a part in this. I'm trying to understand what I'm doing. And I don't, and I'm sorry if it, bothers you or whatever. And I'm trying to change. That is the key element. Everything else can be equal. But if people can do that, if they can look at themselves and take account of their behavior and then be responsible about it, no matter what they're doing, that is just the critical difference that gives people hope or hopelessness. If you're married to a person where the story always is, it's your fault that I'm doing this. If you would just change, I would be different. That creates a very corrosive, toxic, hopeless atmosphere. So that's the one thing I would say.
Okay, you have your marching orders. We are going to take questions because we are recording this. Please make sure that you make your way to the microphone if you would like to ask questions today. I'll talk about one more thing here, and then we'll go ahead and take questions from the mic. So I keep waiting for the age of my children to arrive where it gets easier, and Yeah, okay. And what I get is this kind of reaction, especially from people whose kids are older. They're like, no, it's not easier, it's just different. And so, I mean, navigating those changes over the years, the communication's got to evolve too.
Well,
right?
it reminds me of when you have really little kids, you're like, someday this will be over, they'll be in school, right? And then like,
That's what I thought.
My kids are 25, 21, and 19, and every day we're worrying about something, right?
Sure.
And every day we're having the hard conversations about what should we do about X, Y, or Z, so it doesn't ever go away. But there's a gratification in actually being able to talk in a productive and collaborative way. That's kind of the hope, right? So, the physical exhaustion, I would say, changes, but there's always something. The stakes only get higher. Now we're worrying about, can they support themselves, and will they find happiness and love? You know?
Or we're worrying about our parents and
or that,
the decline that happens there, right? So you kind of get out of one situation and you start to take on another, and that shift is...
And one thing I say, because I have a chapter on the empty nest, which I've just become one of, and I say, it's okay to be a beginner. When you first have a child, you're a beginner. When you first have no kids at home, you're a beginner. Like, what do we want now? Who are we? What are we doing? I think sometimes we feel by that age we should know what's going on. And I think life's not like that. You're always learning.
Are there any additional considerations or tips for when you go through really big life changes, whether it's a change in career, or you're moving to a completely different place, or you've lost a parent, like the big life changes where one or the other partner may not be kind of on their best, right? Yeah. So what other things can people throw in to kind of help through those patches?
I think there's a couple things. I think one is to keep reaching out toward each other, but to respect what the other person needs. And that can be hard sometimes, because sometimes if your partner's gone through something, they're very absorbed and they're not that available to you, and you feel kind of deprived, right? But part of the thing is to keep offering support. The other is to sort of accept that, the point is, I talk about this with the metaphor, the golden ring, but the point is that you're standing next to each other, looking at life and trying to help each other through, right? And there are going to be these things. And so to be able to just accept that there are going to be times when you're not available to each other, when one of you is terribly sad, when, and to sort of understand that that's kind of part of the deal. But I do want to say, and I talk about this, and I have a chapter called Love, Sickness, and Longing, about people who sort of have these very absorbing crushes, even if they're happily married, but they become... And one of the things I've noticed about that in my own clinical work, it's anecdotal, but I'm really interested in studying it further, is I think when people go through a big loss of some kind, maybe lost a parent, maybe lost a job, maybe their child has a big problem, it depletes them and sort of hollows them out, and sometimes then they try to grab something in the world that will excite them, that will distract them. And so I think also just to know your own vulnerability and the vulnerability of your partner when you're going through something very devastating.
Hi.
Hey.
Do you have any advice or thoughts on being in a relationship with someone who has either significantly less or orders of magnitude more income and wealth? And I'm asking for a friend.
I suspect there'll be a lot of that.
Yeah.
Wow, that is so interesting. In my own experience, you realize in adult life you often end up around people about your level of wealth because it's not uncomfortable. You sort of know what everybody can do. But my best friend from high school is extremely wealthy, and so that's sort of my only real... It's fascinating. I haven't given much thought to that. Can you say anything else specific about the struggle or the difficulty there? Or I'll make it. Do you want me to make it up?
I'm gonna go sit down there.
Okay. So one thing I could imagine coming up, which comes up with my friend, is, she's like, hey, let's have a spa weekend. Well, I can't afford the spa weekend, right? So it's like, are you paying? And, then in a couple, I would imagine, there's sort of like, what are the feelings around one person having all this money that they can sort of fund things that can't be equitable, right? Now, what I do with my friend is she gets this huge, spa weekend, then I buy pizza on the way to the spa. So I guess there's got to be some discussion. Money is obviously a huge hot button issue, and there's a whole 50-page chapter on it. But there's got to be some discussion of what the understanding is there, I think, because I think this stuff's so complicated to talk about. We're all so bad at talking about money that I think the main advice I would have is like, make it an explicit conversation. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's going to know what their feelings are, because it's an incredibly confused area for people and very conflicted and very complicated. But at least to be having these sort of conscious, explicit conversations of like, you have this, I have that. How are we going to do this so everyone feels fair? I'll just say one other thing. I think one of the very most important things in a long-term relationship is a sense of fairness and justice. And if people start feeling that's not working, it's very corrosive to the bond. So I think you have to try to understand, what does the money mean to each person? To what extent do they feel you're kind of freeloading? Like, even if they don't want to feel that, they kind of do. Like, try to really get all of this stuff out on the table so you can be kind of conscious about the agreements that you're making. I think that would be really useful.
Would you happen to have any advice for choosing a partner in the first place so that when problems do appear, they're easier to work through?
Great question. I mean, I feel like my next book, because my kids are kind of getting to be that age, is like, how to choose a good partner. Of course, my kids don't want to hear from me about it, right? But, I would say that the most important thing, I don't think it's shared interests, because actually you can bring a lot of different interests, and it's important to have your own interests anyway. I think sometimes people think, well, we've checked all the boxes on all these compatibility things, and I think that's beside the point, actually. I think it's about emotional communication. I mean, obviously it's about the obvious things, attraction, and that you find them fun and like being around them, whatever. Good if there's not a ton of mental illness in their family, just on a purely genetic level. But I would say that it's about whether this person is able to talk through problems. And I wouldn't get married till you've had some opportunities to talk through problems. Weddings are great opportunities to talk through problems. Just be willing to bag it if you can't get through the problems. But I think, sometimes people get together with highly emotional, dramatic people who sort of excite them and activate them, only to find out later the person is a total piece of work, can't regulate their emotions to save their life, and is driving them completely nuts. So I would try to really look at, can this person manage their emotions and talk to me in any sort of reasonable way about what they feel, and can I do the same? So volatility, I think, is something to avoid. Addictions are something to avoid. I could go on, but that would be my main advice.
So if you have a couple where both parties have a tremendous amount in common and just do everything together, but then later on they realize that they do need to get a life and sort of cultivate themselves, what do you think a good framework for that discussion would be? How would the couple find the ways in which they can and should develop themselves in individual ways?
So that's interesting. I'm getting a feeling that question might have within it something like one of the people is feeling a little bit of a need for more of that. Because if both people are feeling like we just love doing everything together and have only shared interests, I can't really say that's a problem, right? I mean, life will introduce difference over time. It just will. You might have different parenting styles. You might have different things you like to do with the kids. You might have different families and different places that you're visiting. I mean, it will introduce it. But say you're in the early courtship, you've been together a while, and you just love doing everything together. That sounds great. I think it's probably more, though, when one person is realizing it's a little claustrophobic here. It's a little too much like this. I need to have more outside. And I think people in certain relationships feel very threatened by individuality. And I think that's something to really take on. I don't think it's a tenable position in a long-term couple to be like, you can't go out with your friends, or, you can't go. That's a problem. I think it's important to hold a space for something like, I love doing everything together. We're incredibly compatible, but sometimes I feel I just want to get out and do stuff with so-and-so or go do this. And I want that to be okay with us. I don't want it to feel unsafe. I don't want it to feel insecure. I don't want you to be too anxious. Anxiety is a huge thing in relationships. And part of relationships is working through why you're anxious, what can I do to make you less anxious. But claustrophobia and having to always be together is usually over the long haul a problem. So if I were the person who was feeling like I just want a little more elbow room here, I would just try to introduce it as, I think it would be really healthy for our relationship. Hey, let's read this book. It says it would be healthy for our relationship to have a few things that we do alone, just to have more interest and more, because as life goes on, I see couples who are in the middle of life and they're like, our life's really boring and understimulating because I feel like my spouse doesn't have any interests or they're always sort of watching TV or whatever. So to sort of talk about it in terms of the benefit to the relationship of bringing more stuff in, I think might help.
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak to living together before marriage a little bit. I'm in this situation where a lot of my friends and people I know who are in their mid-20s out in Seattle, they see kind of living together before marriage as a good trial period to see what it's going to be like to be with this person for the rest of your life. But then on the other side, I have my parents and people their age who say, no, you can't do that because living together without a bigger sense of commitment just makes it too easy to kind of run away at the earliest sign of trouble. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
That's a great question. And I think the research on that is kind of all over the map. So I'm just going to talk kind of from my own gut kind of about this. I think that, living together will confront you with the problems of living, like someone said. Like just, you'll have to work stuff out. And that can actually help you figure out, can we work stuff out, right? So that's on the plus side. I think that on the negative side is now at my age, looking back, because, some of my friends are divorced, some aren't, it does seem to me that people kind of who backed into relationships, who weren't really wild about this person, who maybe felt persuaded by the other person, oh, let's live together, we're not really marrying, it's just a step toward, if in your heart you don't feel like, I really want to be in this, to live together to see if you might then be more in love, I think is a bad plan. Because once your lives are merged and that we bought furniture together and we have a dog, it's so hard to ever really see things clearly and say, well, I got into this in a sort of half-hearted way, and now how am I going to possibly get out? So I think it takes a real reckoning with yourself. Like, am I in love with this person? Like, do I really want to be with this person? They may want to be with me more than I want to be with them. I got to be truthful about that now, because it's going to be way harder to get out of it in 5 years. So I think the parents are thinking that way. They're sort of, whether you have a marriage contract, have a license, it's like in my mind, kind of who cares? But if your emotional feeling is not that this is really like the one, I think it can be very costly. And more costly to women, just in terms of biological clock, frankly. So, I would be more, my daughter, I would be more worried about moving in with someone than my son, probably.
Should couples strive for happiness or contentment as individuals? It's kind of vague, so I don't know if there's really a distinction or is there semantics. What do you think?
Well, so wait, when you say as individuals, what does that mean?
Like, I'm happy, I'm content. She's happy, she's content, we're good.
Yeah.
Is there a distinction there, or is there like no?
You mean like if we're content with each other, is that enough? Is that what you're saying?
Or content with our relationship, our family, or just happy about the relationship.
Well, right. So this is so fascinating, right? Because we live in this culture where there's so much written about being happy, right? And there's sort of this standard, like, are you happy? And then you feel like you're falling short if you just actually have a calm, happy, pleasant, sane life. Again, I'd almost say it's similar to my answer to the other person in terms of, do you feel something's missing, right? In some subjective sense. I think some people are just much calmer, much happier in a domestic, much more contented in a domestic arrangement where they get along and they appreciate that and they feel, satisfied with that. And other people need a lot of excitement, right? And it's sort of knowing yourself seems to be the important thing in terms of, what do I need in my life? I have a friend whose son just got married very young. And basically, they both just love nesting. Like, that's who they are. They like a home. They like being home together. They like, buying little rugs and couches. And that's who they are. Other people would be like, oh, I couldn't stand that. I need to, hike Mount Everest or whatever. So it really kind of depends, too, on sort of how you're made and how you're made together. Hi.
Hi. So, while people are dating, like me and my friends like to say comments on, who they're dating and say, oh, they're totally for you, or like, no, they're no good, like you should totally date somebody else. But once they're married, you sort of don't have that kind of conversation, maybe because, we're supposed to forever hold out silence, because we didn't say anything then. Do you think that is okay? Like, is that beneficial to just, now that they're married, just let them be? Or if you do notice something that, I'll be okay with them talking about the spouse behind the back, just
Wait,
as
so
a
are you
friend.
saying, should you say something to the friend about her spouse, or should the friend say something to you about her spouse?
Yeah, should we as friends have a conversation at all about
Yeah.
other people's spouse?
Right. So this is really interesting. So I'm of the view that if you have a close friend and you really have questions about who they're with, that you should talk to them about it. So we're talking before they get married, right? Before they make that decision. I believe that. Because I think who else is necessarily going to say it? And you know them, and you may see something they don't see. And in fact, I just read a book that's sort of about people who've been married for a very long time and sort of what advice they give for younger people. And one of the things they say is if your friends or family are expressing doubts about your partner, listen to them. And the idea there is that you may have, because you're in love or whatever, you don't have as clear a picture as they do. And so the people you trust, you should listen to. And I thought that was really good advice. But I do think, and I talk about this in my class with these couples who are having their first baby, part of the issue when you make a family and a little unit of the couple and the child is you have to create a certain boundary around that. You have to have a filter for the in-laws and everybody else weighing in, right? And I do think it's probably risky to a marriage to feel like you have a closer channel with your girlfriends than your spouse. Just in terms of that family structure and building something, it can be a problem unto itself if every time you're having a fight with your husband, you're telling your best girlfriend about it. Like that doesn't create trust with your husband. But I think it's a really tricky thing to navigate that shift, right? Basically, it seems to me when your friend says, we've decided to get married, I would sort of think it's time to just stop weighing in. But I would be inclined also not to then continue to have the same kind of girlfriend relationship about every complaint she has about him. I'd be kind of like, I just think that's a dividing line in my mind.
One of your earlier comments around, if there's that one thing we take away, and it was basically like self-awareness was the thing that kind of sets relationships apart. And I guess my question is, what happens when one partner brings something up and the other person doesn't acknowledge it as a problem? So I have two specific examples. So one, I don't know if you've ever heard, there's like a New Yorker or Harper's article on like emotional labor about how like, not to stereotype, but like a lot of women take on a lot of like planning for the family or like doing certain little things or things that, cleaning up a little bit. And then a lot of times their spouses don't consider those important, so they don't consider it something they need to do. Mm-hmm. And another example, I have, some friends that are having issues with their in-laws, right? So like they have different opinions and they look to their husbands for support, and they don't get it because the husbands don't see it as a problem. Mm-hmm. So I guess, self-awareness is there, but they have, how do you address if they don't even see something as an issue? Right.
No, it's huge. Those are both really, really common things and really important things, and not easy, obviously. So I think I want to try to answer it from two angles. These are deeply emotional issues that, division of labor and in-laws. Sometimes when we don't see eye to eye on them, we try to just manage our own feelings, maybe suppress them, not voice them, work around it, whatever. But we come to a point where we feel so challenged by it that we might express it in a very strong, maybe negative way. At which point, the partner is reacting purely to the negativity and just then minimizes. Basically, I see the partner in that, like just trying to survive emotionally, sort of like tries to shut you down because it's like, oh, that's not a problem, which is basically like, I don't want to feel all the awful feelings that talking about this has created. And then that person shuts down, and then the other person starts getting more reactive and more upset. So I just want to differentiate the actual problem, which are real problems that need solutions, from the process that gets going when you can't find common ground, or you just feel like you keep butting up against the wall. And what I'd like to suggest is that especially in these very emotionally loaded issues, you feel unapologetic for your stance and your emotions, namely in these cases, like it actually is an unfair division of emotional labor, or we're a family unit now and we need to figure out a functional way for us to stand up to the in-laws. Those are legitimate issues that a person has every right to demand a solution to. And to keep that in mind enough to say, this is an issue that we need to have as neutral as possible a discussion on. In other words, it's not all about my reactivity to you. It's about, this isn't fair, or this isn't working. And then to go from that, because really what happens often is when we're highly emotional, the other person shuts down because they're reacting to our emotion. So I feel like you have to keep advocating, keep bringing it to the table, not be willing to be shut down by, oh, this is just you being emotional, or you have a special problem with my mother, but just keep being the rational, fair-minded person that you are at work to solve this problem. And I think people don't always think of it that way because it seems so kind of denuded of the emotion, but I think that's actually, Gottman, again, from Washington, talks about being as neutral as possible in talking about highly emotional issues is key. And I think what happens sometimes in these situations is people are trying to emotionally survive, so they start blaming the other person for how they feel and minimizing, right? And what's so hard and challenging in that moment is to say, I'm going to hold on. I'm going to hold on to my point of view. I'm going to continue to assert it in a calm way, and I'm not going to give up on this until we come to a workable solution. That takes fortitude, it takes courage, it takes energy, it takes all sorts of stuff, but that's the basic stance I think is important. And I also think I said this, but I'm just going to say it again. I don't believe it's a tenable position in a long-term marriage to say, I don't want to talk about it. You have to learn how to talk about things. And it's not okay for the person saying, why are you always harping on this? I do plenty around here, or whatever it is. That's not going to be the end of that conversation. It just, you have to say, no, it's a problem for me. One thing I talk about in my class with the parents of, babies to be, is you're the grown-ups now. There's no parent out there deciding what's right and wrong and which sibling is right. When you're a kid, it's like, you started it. No, you started. Oh, I don't care who started it. You go to your room. You are not, people can sometimes have these sort of sibling-esque kind of ideas about there's some right or wrong on high that could be handed down. All the marriage is about is caring about each other and caring about each other's feelings. So if someone's minimizing your feelings, saying, well, I don't feel that way, so it's not real, that's not a stance that is going to work for you in the long haul. The stance is, oh, well, I don't see it that way. I don't see my mother as a problem, but you do. So let's try to figure this out so that you're not suffering because you're my wife and I care about you. That's where you're trying to go here.
So thank you so much. We greatly appreciate you coming today.
Thank you very much for coming.